Greetings and salutations, and welcome to this episode of Playwright Spotlight. Before we begin, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below, and share this video with a friend. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. My guest today is the former director of the Interdisciplinary Program in Creative Writing at the University of Tulsa, where he taught playwriting, screenwriting, and narrative film production. He founded and moderated the Fictional Character Writers Collective and co-founded the Playwrights Lab of Tulsa. He's written 2 books on playwriting for Heinemann, Playwriting Masterclass, and Playwriting in Process. His titles include Blood Relations and Knees and Toes. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Michael Wright. Sir, how are you today?
I'm doing great. I need to update you on my books, but we can do that later on.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it right now so everybody knows, so they can go out and get them as we speak.
Okay. All of the books now are published by Hackett Publishers.
Hackett Publishers. Perfect.
In Boston. And there are actually 3 titles they carry currently. One is called Playwriting in Process.
Okay.
The other is called Playwriting Masterclass.
Wonderful.
And the newest one is called Sensory Writing for Stage and Screen. They're also available on Amazon. So
wonderful. Yeah. That's good to know. So on that note, then let's talk about this latest book.
Okay.
Sensory for the Stage.
Sensory Writing for Stage and Screen. Yep.
So how does that work? How does sensory writing for the stage work?
Well, I teach a lot of writing classes. The ones that you mentioned, I also teach a screenwriting class for older people. So one of the things that I'm trying to get into everybody's head is the notion that we don't just see a movie, we can smell it if you'll include things that we can smell. We can taste things if you'll provide that. Maybe people watching this have seen Babette's Feast, for example, which is a brilliant movie about a maid who's finally given permission to cook for this family she's working for, her home-based food. So she prepares this lavish feast, and your eyes are just eating up the stuff that she's putting out there. I wanted to provide a way for people to think about aspects of touch, aspects of hearing, beyond simply dialogue or music, so that when I was listening on headphones to an episode of the TV show The Wire, I was astonished at how many layers of sound there were built into it. I mean, it's a brilliantly produced show, and that may have been what triggered this. Just think, wow, look, there's all this ambient sound that they were very careful to either record or create or put into a studio someplace. So that got me interested in that, and then I went on from there.
So how does that apply to playwriting in the stage?
Well, it applies both in the film world and the playwriting world, because again, we're talking about circumstances where the audience might observe something sensorily or even experience. I went to a brilliant show in Boston, staged by a company that I guess focuses on circus and acrobat kind of stuff. And at a certain point, they say, okay, everybody, we're going to peel all of these bananas, and everybody set your phones for 30 minutes timer. And they squished it up and did all this stuff. And at the end of 30 minutes, all the phones went off with various points, and we had banana bread. So we could smell it cooking, and we could have it afterwards. We could eat it. It was fantastic. There are a few plays that are about cooking, where people cook on stage. I'm not going to grab the names off the top of my head.
Sure.
One was an Australian play, and Tina Howe, I think, wrote one where the actor cooks on stage, and so it's an active thing. And again, it's a beautiful sensory reality. Yeah, and I think having seen such brilliant stuff long time back in New York, like The Elephant Man, where the guy playing the role comes out and he's beautifully physically, and then as they describe the deformities of the Elephant Man, he slowly but surely turns into that. So it's not about makeup, it's not about mask, it's not about adding stuff on. It was him creating the body. Wow, what a powerful experience. So that's the roots of that kind of stuff.
Wonderful. And where did you get your start in playwriting? How did you start out?
Well, there's a guy named Jeff Sweet that you might want to know at some point. He's a great writer and great teacher of playwriting. He and I met when I was the stage manager at the Actors Studio. And I was watching a playwriting unit being run by a pretty well-known playwright. It's not important who. But he and Jeff and I decided that it was only that leader's voice that was getting through, and the other playwrights were kind of frustrated. And we started talking about, well, what if we had a group of people that were also actors and directors talking about playwriting as performance, not just on the page. So we founded this group that ultimately became known as the New York Writers Block, BLOC. And one of the things that Jeff did was create a short form called a 6-line. A says, B says, A says, B says, A says, B says, done. And it let everybody write. We had a different theme every week, games, money, jewelry, whatever. And so everybody tried writing, and I did too. And my writing was hitting people in a good way. And I thought, oh. So I started writing plays. I wrote, I think, 3 full lengths, and then the fourth one it's Blood Relations. It's very successful. Won a National Endowment for the Arts and the whole 9 yards. So for most of my professional life, I've been a playwright. These days, I'm much more of a novelist because I like controlling the narrative, and I get tired of rejection, just like every other playwright does. I get tired of sending my stuff out and having it come back. I just self-publish on Amazon these days.
Well, what about self-producing then?
I've done some of that. There's a gallery that I belong to, an arts gallery that, as a member, I've been able to propose projects, and so we'll go in and do a 3 or 4 day thing in the gallery space, and the idea behind that is to work in a non-traditional environment so that the audience seating might be very radically different. I want the first show, not the first, but the second show I did, the audience sat in a long line, but back to back. And one wall had a huge broken mirror, or the effect of a broken mirror. The other had mirrors in fragments all over it. And so you could either watch the performers in front of you, or you could watch the people as the performance moved around, watch them behind you in the mirror, or you could turn around in your chair. It was great. And we did a lot of stuff like that. It got interrupted by COVID, but I plan to be back next year with a new project. So yeah.
What's the worst rejection letter you've ever received?
Well, I'll tell you, most theaters are very, very generous. The worst comment I ever got was submitting a sort of a fantasy novel to an agent who was a friend of mine, who then told me, we met briefly as he was leaving his office because he was on a run for running. He said, "Look, I don't want to waste your time." He said, we're not gonna take your book on. I said, "Why? What's wrong with it?" He said, "You just don't have enough genius to pull off your concept." Here, my heart. So as far as playwriting rejections, it hasn't really been that. I mean, nobody's been mean, frankly. But you wait and wait and wait and wait, and then you'll get the letter that says, "Well, thank you very much. It's not for us." Okay, well, all right, that's fine. I don't, in those days, especially when I was doing it full time, I just kind of looked at myself as a small mail order business. I would mail out my script, and if they didn't like it, they would mail it back with the self-addressed stamped envelope. Now you can do it electronically. It's a lot faster. But again, I found a number of companies very generous. So I submitted to one company knowing that I probably wasn't right for what they did, but they said, "Listen, we really liked your stuff. It's not quite what we're typically prone to do. We're going to send it along to another theater because we think maybe they will." I'm like, "Thank you." That's that kind of kindness is pretty remarkably true throughout theater, I think, these days. So yeah.
Wonderful. In Playwriting Masterclass, you mentioned that the playwrights that are featured in that book, they take one of 3 approaches to the craft: dreams, journeys, and then what you call cut from whole cloth.
Yep.
Can you talk about each of those?
Well, it was a very serendipitous thing. I picked initially I picked 6 playwrights, and then for the second edition, I added a 7th playwright. I wanted some playwrights of color. I had a woman who is African American / Japanese, a friend of mine who is Chinese. The guy that I added is African American. I wanted at least one gay playwright. It turned out that Gary Garrison was that, and he was very freaked out about being asked to write a gay play. It totally floored him. And then it turned out the other woman that I invited, Julie Jensen, is also gay. So there's that. And then my friend Elena is in the book, and she comes from a border area, El Paso, kind of Hispanic American background. And then the two people, David Crespi and Elizabeth Wong, both just out of their notes that they sent me, they said, "Oh, I would like to work from dreams, or I won't start a draft until I've had a dream about the play." And I was like, "Oh my God!" So they got put together. The middle section is people who started out with one idea and pursued that, and then rejected it and went to a different idea and pursued that, etc. I think Elena wrote 3 or 4 different short plays until she finally found the one that she was trying to find. And then the last one is Guillermo, so I'm losing his last name. It'll show up in a minute. And Julie Jensen, both of whom were very, very precise writers and very precise rewriters. And Julie was very visual in the way that she rewrote. And in fact, we made that into the original cover because you would see a line crossing out a bit of dialogue and then a different way of putting in the rewrite of that dialogue. And it was gorgeous. It was like a roadmap through her thinking, you know? So yeah, it was, I loved working with those people. I'd do it again in a minute.
Yeah, because you mentioned that you would wish that we had insight into Tony Kushner's approach when it came to Angels in America.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you which one of those do you subscribe to, if any of them? How do you approach your playwriting?
Well, I'm very intuitive. So when I sit down to write something, it's based on what Moises Kaufman once told me. His process was, he says, I start from a hunch. And I love that. I do too, but I don't quite get as sophisticated as he does. He's a much more brilliant mind than I am. But I start with an image. Knees and Toes is based on my friend Ira, who died of stomach cancer. And when he died, he was a brilliant photographer and illustrator. When he died, he willed his body to the teaching hospital. And I thought, well, where did his eyes go? What did they do with those? Because that's the only thing that they could transplant from a cancer patient, was the eyes, the cornea, maybe specifically. And I thought, okay, who got those, and what did could they now see in the same way that he did? And so that provoked this play, Knees and Toes. Yeah. And it took me forever to find it. And it's one of those plays that I still want to have. I've had 2 productions of it. I wasn't satisfied with my writing. I thought both productions were pretty decent, but my writing was not very good. So, it's not a play that I feel like I've entirely found, So yeah.
Do you revisit it frequently to try to get it to the place that you want it?
Only in the back of my mind. I've been busy for once I retired, I started writing novels. And I really like that because I have control over the narrative, but also the marketing and everything else. But yeah, it has revisited me occasionally. I'm just kind of pops
well,
up.
I like how you phrase that, though, that it revisits you. And I think that we have to remember that sometimes as writers, that, it's ready. It'll be ready when we are.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people tend to forget that.
Yeah. And I used to tell my students, listen, don't worry about making your play work. Write the best you can and then leave it alone, and it will be thinking about you. And when it's decided it wants to tell you something, it'll show up. So yeah, I mean, that's very mystical and all that, but it's how I work. So
I'm going to go back to the Tony Kushner statement that we were talking about, and that you wish that we would have been able to see the process, each draft or anything like that. So do you, when you write, do you save your drafts? I do. I mean, I'll each one I'll label 1.2, 1.3, and then maybe if I do a complete rewrite and total change, I'll go to 2.1, 2.2, and so forth. I mean, so do you keep all your drafts in case that there's something that you wrote in the past is saved brilliantly that you can, I really like that, I should go back and find that and put that back in?
Yeah, and I try not to overwrite. I used to do that when I was a much younger writer, just rewriting on top of the original. But no, I don't do that anymore. I try. I'm not quite as meticulous as you are. I guess I'll just call it third draft without worrying if it's 3.2 or whatever. But yeah, and I just to go back for 1 second about Playwriting Masterclass, one of the key purposes of that of that book is to give you the sense that you can look over the writer's shoulder as they're working. I love what Susan Laurie Parks does. I wish I could go back in time and sit down with Heinrich Ibsen and say, okay, babe, how are you going about your process?
Sure.
I really I love process, and I'm always curious as to how people approach the work that they do.
Well, hopefully that this will be one of those things that in 30, 40, 50 years, people can look back on Playwright Spotlight and talk about everybody's process, and that,
Yeah, yeah.
including Michael Wright. So let's talk about process. What is your process? I mean, once you sit down, do you start? Is it linear? Do you just, I have a great idea for this scene, I'll worry about how I get there later, or do you start in a very beginning, middle, and then end?
It depends on the project. I'd say probably most of the time I start at a beginning point. With this latest novel, which is called In the Air, I moved a scene that was very, very late in the story to the very beginning of the novel because I didn't want to get into all of the complications that that particular story would create late in the character's journey. So I moved it early on, and that helped to provoke a bunch of stuff that followed. So it seemed like it was the good thing to do. Sometimes I'll just write a scene and explore and see what the scene might have in it. Sometimes I'm looking to test out character voices, whether it's for a play or even for a novel. But generally speaking, I have a sense of the story that I'm trying to tell, and I make a lot of false starts and I go back and rewrite and stuff. What I do is I use the workshops that I have as testing grounds for the material. So I'm working on a short story collection at the moment, and we've read the 4 that I have available right now. I'm going to start working on the 5th one Monday. So if I'm not clear on what I'm doing, I may just bring in a segment of the short story or a segment of the novel. I have encouraged my students not to be afraid of not only failing but getting lost, but also not to be afraid of writing a scene where they really know what's going on, and then okay, we'll fill in around that. Act 2 of a screenplay in particular is a kind of I call it Alcoholics Alley. Because it's like, oh, all right, I started the problem, everything is in the air, everything is I'm going crazy. Now what the hell? I got 50 some pages that I've got to do that until I get toward the end of the story I'm trying to tell. So.
Do you, since you do screenplays as well, do you subscribe to that structure to playwriting? Like if we take a save the cat approach to screenwriting, do you do the same thing in your playwriting where it's just like, okay, by this page I need to have this, by this page or just
no,
like
no, not at all, not at all. If I have any models that I follow with regard to that, it would probably be screenplays like Memento. It would be plays like Betrayal, where they're messing around with structure and trying to tell a story in a way that, because this is the thing that I've always said to my students, and I still do to the people I work with, make the audience a partner. My big thing, and I don't know if I ever convinced all of my students, but many of them got it triggered. I said, look, if you think about a play or a screenplay as a mystery, what's going to happen? How's it going to play out? And I said, the original detective story is Oedipus. It's a whodunit. The only problem for Oedipus is, I done it. And I think many of them really, really like that. But, if an audience doesn't feel really engaged, I saw something at a theater in London a bunch of years ago, and every scene was followed by a costume change on stage. And I lost the will to care about that particular play. I stayed because I do that, but I just thought, this is not trying to engage me. It's making me passive. And as a writer, no matter what form I write in, and I write radio as well, I want the audience to feel like they're a partner and to feel as if it's important that they keep working to help the play along, help the screenplay, the novel, what have you.
How do you achieve that?
I think you achieve it by not letting the story. One of the things that I've been preaching lately to some of the fairly new playwrights that I've been working with is stop being the talking through your characters to tell the story. Let us watch what they do, listen to what they say, notice what they don't say or won't do or don't do, and put it together from there. I think of storytelling as an accrual, like you have a basket and you get this fact and you get another fact and another, and they start adding up. And what's beautiful about audiences and readers and all that is that you can drop in a fact very early on, and if it's placed well, they'll remember it when you bring that fact back 30, 40 pages later, because you've placed it well, and you placed it well because you've said to the audience, in effect, "Oh, this is interesting. This you need to remember. This is really key." It's kind of like Chekhov's gun in a certain way, But yeah, I think it's achieved by never letting the audience get ahead of the story, and certainly keeping them in a situation where they know who they're rooting for and they know who they're rooting against, but giving them the opportunity to think that the antagonist might win. So yeah. The plays that I have really, really loved have been plays that have just been spectacularly mysterious, just really engaging. I'm a big fan of Martin McDonagh. I just saw that beautiful thing that he wrote. What is it called? It's got an Irish.
The Banshees
The
of
Banshees thing. Yeah, yeah. You're watching this thing and thinking, what the hell is going to happen with these two guys? One guy says to the other guy, "I don't like you anymore," and the guy who's not liked is like desperate to be liked, and he's like, "Oh my god," Well, that kept me riveted. So yeah.
Do you think plays can be that simple?
I think they can be that simple, and they can also be that complex. I think it depends. I mean, I do like the idea. There's a mantra of sort of complex characters, simple stories. I think that's not a bad guideline to go by. The audience should be able to follow the story for the most part. But if your intention is to baffle the audience, I shared a script of the Memento that I have with a friend, and she says, I don't know I'm lost." I'm like, "Well, okay. Here's a way that you could possibly think about what's going on with the character's sense of a limited memory, and maybe that will help you get a way of that." Because I didn't want to tell her the secret. I think I'm trying to think of the most complicated plays I've seen have been like Moises Kaufman wrote a thing called 33 Variations. And I don't think it works entirely because it's intellectual, as opposed to Kushner's Angels in America, which is also very intellectual, but you're just so immersed in the vulnerability of these people. I mean, especially the wife. Oh my God, that poor woman. She's going through so much, and your empathy just has to go out to her if you're going to stay engaged in the play. Paula, oh golly, Ned. How I Learned to Drive. Also, very, very complicated play, but couched in a very, very simple fashion, so that you can find your way into it. I'm actually talking about two plays that starred Mary Louise Parker, so maybe you need Mary Louise Parker for your plays to work. I don't really, but anyway, it's a situation where the audience the audience comes in wanting to have a good time and wanting to let go of their day. They want, as soon as the lights go up or the curtain goes up, they want to be in that world. I mean, most of the time. Well, okay, fine. Put them in that world and suspend that world in such a way that they don't know where it's going to land by the time we get to the end of it. We don't know what's going to happen in How I Learned to Drive with Little Bit. All we can see is that this uncle is slowly encroaching into her world. And is he going to succeed in seducing her? Is he going to succeed in marrying her? That's insane. But if we don't worry about her, then there's no point of the play. Nothing.
you mentioned layers. How do you? What's the best way to add layers without confusing either yourself or your audience?
Well, the most obvious answer is subplot, but I don't usually write plays with subplots. So I'm giving you an answer that I myself couldn't necessarily apply. I think, to me, one of the things that I talk to all my writers about is the idea of texture. And texture is, again, this goes back to this whole idea of sensory writing. Texture is where you're beginning to get degrees of personal elements that create something brilliant, in such a way that you are able to lean into the life of the character and understand a little bit about them. There's a brilliant moment in On the Waterfront, and it's probably Brando improvising. The Eva Marie Saint, they're out on a swing set. She drops her glove. He picks it up. He's obviously a big guy, big hands. He's a stevedore. He starts putting the glove on. Well, my God, that is such a brilliant moment, because it's as if he wants her vulnerability, her softness, maybe even her size or whatever, but it's not possible. And it's like a turning point in the whole film where something in his heart opens up. That's texture. Doesn't move the story forward at all. Not at all. And it just gives us this insight into the character in such a way. Um, Texture is when Willie Loman comes home for the first time, and he says, "I'm tired to the death." That's his first line. I mean, man, that kind of stuff is just extremely, extremely potent. Yeah, yeah.
I'm glad you brought up texture, because that was one of the questions that I had listed on there. So how do you playwrights achieve that? How do playwrights achieve texture? How do they sprinkle it throughout their pieces?
Well, I think it comes down to being a good observer, and using your observer consciousness to recreate stuff that you've seen around you. Um, I developed a lecture. I was invited to lecture at Gothenburg University in Sweden through a friend. It wasn't because I'm famous or anything; it's just a friend's connection. And I thought, well, what could I talk about? I talked about the playwright's jobs. And one of the very, very first jobs is observing, is just really noticing what's going on around you. In my playwriting and process book, for example, there are etudes that are about really observing how people live. You walk into an apartment, what's the smell that hits you right off the bat? You might not be able to get that smell on stage, but a character could comment on it in some kind of fashion. But observing is about understanding that all our senses are storing all the time. We're incredibly complex machines. So knowing that a character, I was noticing, I'm watching the Crown, and I was noticing how Prince Charles always puts one hand in his jacket pocket. He doesn't. His jacket pockets are straight across; they're not slashed. So he does that. I don't know what that does for him, but it creates a kind of a security. It gives him a kind of a posture. Maybe it makes him stand a little bit more erect than he might normally. I don't really know, but I'm interested in it, and I'm noticing it, and I'm thinking, okay, well, could I ever use that for a character? A character who, like me, I can't keep my hands off my face sometimes. I'm always playing with my beard. Well, what can you do with that? How can you build that in? And again, you're working in a situation where your collaborators are as important as you as a writer. And certainly, if you get a good actor and you say to the actor in the stage directions, he has a nervous habit of touching himself in some way that's not objectionable, but is a habit. Good. They'll figure something out. They'll, burn their ear or their bear, whatever. I don't want to dictate behavior to an actor, but I do want to suggest the possibility of behavior and texture so that they can run with that. Because a really good actor, a well-trained actor, will create all that anyway. They're going to want to do it.
And that was my next question, because you brought up a few of those things, and I'm like, how many of those things are the actor's job, and how many of those are the playwright's job?
Yep. Well, I caution everybody I work with not to direct the play or the screenplay on the page. You don't need to
Yeah, agreed.
say he gets up from the chair, he walks to the door, he turns the knob. Oh my God,
Sure.
just he answers the door. that's, that's enough, Um, and I think the problem for a lot of people that I have worked with over the years is that they're too accustomed to reading like Sam French or dramatist scripts, and what they're reading is stage manager's notes of the performance that was done, rather than the original play, which might not have had that kind of detail in it. If it's crucial, if it's absolutely 1,000% crucial that I describe a moment for a character, I will. Otherwise, yeah, I'm going to hope, and it's a crapshoot. I'm going to hope that I get an actor and a director and team who will be able to go that far with how they explore the play and how then they present the play. I've known many actors who are just extraordinarily good at doing research and backgrounds and coming up with things on their own, doing animal exercises, doing exercise, playing with props, making the prop an extension of the character. That's all good stuff that either they will do on their own or they'll do with the help of a director or improvisationally in rehearsal. So that's what you hope for. I've had that kind of experience, and then I've had experiences down here which were actors who pretty much just said the words and they thought that was enough, and it's not. You have to embody the character in a way that's going to communicate on a whole lot of different levels. So yeah.
How do you translate that on the page for the actor to pick up those moments that you were mentioning, or that
Well,
you hope that they pick up?
yeah. Well, it's a combination of stage directions that are not intrusive. Like, for example, I get into a thing with my writers: don't write dialect because it looks like some other language when you do that. Just say, this guy is from, I knew a guy when I was in grad school, and you would ask him just as a joke because he would do it on purpose. You'd say, where are you from, Leonard? He said, Paducah, Kentucky. If you could get that imbued in an actor for them to figure out the accent and how it goes from there, they'll do it. They'll do it. And it's the same thing with actions. The less you impose yourself on the actor and on the company in general, the better. I think if there's something that you absolutely have to have, he picks up a letter opener and toys with it, eyeing the other person, and we understand it's meant to be thought of in that moment as a knife. Okay, that's fine.
Does that become a Chekhov moment then?
Well, it kind of depends on what the story of the play is. I would say that if a character wants to make a threat, they don't necessarily have to carry it through. It depends on the weight, the volume, if you will, of the threat,
Sure.
how noisy a threat it is. So yeah.
Sure. You mentioned the job of the playwright.
Yeah.
One of them. And what are the other jobs of the playwright?
Well, there's there's the observer, there's the dreamer, intuitive person who's willing to just kind of let the play or the ideas for the play cycle through them. There's the crafts person who needs to be able to get it down on the page in a way that's going to be proper in terms of format, but also be credible in terms of really, really solid dialogue. There's the artist, that's the next phase, and the artist is the person who will then take a look at what the craftsperson is doing and say, okay, how can I heighten this in some fashion? How can I bring this to a more exquisite place so that it's going to really find fantastic expression? I mean, if you look, for example, at Kushner's Angels in America, how do you come up with the behavior of the crazy right-wing lawyer guy? I'm grabbing his name. You know what I'm talking about. Yeah. He's got 5 phones going all the time. I can't think of his name. I've seen at least 4 or 5 productions of that play and Mike Nichols' film as well, and everybody approaches that character a little differently, just a little differently, and that's but the essence is always there. The essence is always he's willing to put somebody on hold. He's on, pick it up, yell, "Who are you?" That kind of stuff. So I think it gets built into the dialogue, but it also, again, it's the artistry of. Well, there's a brilliant issue of the Dramatist Guild magazine. I don't know if you get that or not, but it's Sondheim's doing a speech someplace, and oh my God, does he break down the craft brilliantly? I mean, oh, so this is a guy who really knew what he was doing, but he was a craftsman and an artist, and I think the artist challenges the craftsman to step up to the next level. After that, the next person or the next persona is the editor, who just, okay, well, you did your writing. Now I'm gonna go have a beer, and then I'll come back and I'm gonna get this thing under control. And then the last of that is the business person, who really understands that you have a product, and how do you get that product out there, and how do you deal with contracts and all the other stuff that goes along with it. So.
You mentioned solid dialogue.
Yeah.
What makes solid dialogue?
I think if it's coming out of a character that you understand well, you will be able to inhabit their mindset and provide their voice pretty reasonably. And again, a good craftsperson will go back and, I used to say to my students, how many ways are there to say to good morning? You say, well, good morning, hello, how are you? What's up? What's the whatever, whatever. And I say, okay, what of those is the most accurate for that particular character? And you find that, the French word, the French term, le mot juste, not to sound pretentious, but the perfect word, the right phrase. And if it's consistent with who the character is, then it will continue to work. It'll continue to have the appropriate energy, the appropriate point of view. Characters don't change in midstream. That was something I had to learn as a very young playwright. So, in process, you're always in discovery. And I'll give you an example. This play Blood Relations was workshopped a number of times in Washington before they finally fully produced it. And the guy playing the other brother, who was still with the father, a brilliant actor named Jim Fife, I had written for his character named Sonny. I'd written that anytime Sonny thought something was really good, really nice, really great, he would say, "Oh, cool." And Jimmy said one time in rehearsal, "Would you mind if I tried something a little different?" And I'd worked with Jimmy. I trusted him to the moon and back. I said, "No, go for it." So somebody said something and he agreed with it, and he went, "Excellent."
Mm-hmm.
Well, that went into the script because that's brilliant, and it came out of Jim, and it came out of this context of this particular character and all. So yeah, so it's about crafting dialogue that, I mean, I say to my writers, I said, look, my playwrights, you're playing with dolls. That's what we do. Hi, Barbie, I'm home from work. Oh, hello, Ken, how are you? How was your day? And if you're not just voicing your own voice through those people, but voicing their voice, it's going to communicate, and it's going to convey. Yeah. And my big mantra is read a million plays, see a million plays, see a million films, read a million screenplays, because that's the study. That's part of what we have to do. We have to be students, and that's how you start discovering some of the richness of dialogue and craft that are available to other people. The only thing I disagree with is having people write plays based on reading Arthur Miller or whatever. Try to stay
Sure.
away from that. If I had my students at TU, University of Tulsa, reading anything, it was 10-minute plays. Because it's intimidating to think, oh, I'm going to try to write like Tennessee Williams. Oh, I can't. Oh, ooh.
What steps do you, and I do want to get back to that as well. What steps do you recommend for playwrights or students to take in order to know their characters? You said solid dialogue comes from knowing your characters. How do you dive into that?
Well, again, playwriting in process is all about exercises that people can use in order to explore a character's given reality. What do I do for a living? What are my hobbies? What does my apartment look like? Who's my best friend? How would I behave if I know a disaster is impending, and how would I deal with that? Again, this all the eyes are in the mind of the character. Observing people, talking to tons and tons of people. Gary's great about that. I don't think Gary's ever met a stranger. He just goes for it. And I'm a little bit more. I tend to sit back and observe more. He engages. Um, but for me, the process is exploring what I might not understand out of my own experiences that the character, him or herself, could have in them. And I'll give you a very different example. There's a play that I got to watch being written called The Model Apartment by Donald Margulies. And in it, there's an old couple who have escaped from their daughter who's schizophrenic and making their lives miserable. And she finds them. And when she arrives, she has with her this African American guy who's much younger than she is. He's like a teenager. And they start making a lot of trouble for the couple. Well, Donald wrote a scene because he was trying to find the young man's voice. He wrote a scene where the young guy is trying very unsuccessfully to sell a gun to someone in Central Park in New York. So he had a way of exploring this guy's voice outside of play. So he wasn't trying to figure out how he was going to speak in the play. He needed to understand, well, how does this guy speak normally anyhow? Mm. And to me, that was part of the inspiration for playwriting and process, was watching Donald, watching Jeffrey, watching other writers, and then drawing on my experiences with Viola Spolin and some other practitioners that were not just, okay, do it this way kind of theater people. Yeah.
You mentioned watching a million plays, reading a million plays, and that's usually a chunk of advice you hear a bit, watch and read. I don't think, and maybe I'm wrong, that things just automatically click by doing that. So what are you looking for when you read these plays, when you watch these plays? What exactly are you looking for in order to apply them to the craft? Because I really, honestly, I don't know.
Yeah, I think the simplest answer to that is I'm trying to think of his name because I'm old and names don't come easily. One of the people that I invited into the second edition of Playwriting Masterclass, Aaron Carter. And Aaron Carter, as a dramaturg and as the leader of talkbacks, had this thing that he would ask, sometimes at the beginning, sometimes later on, depending on how the audience was responding. He'd say, well, where did you find yourself leaning forward? And to me, that's what it's all about. And I might not physically lean forward while I'm watching the play, but my mind is doing that. And if I find myself leaning away, or if I'm just kind of sitting there feeling passive and neutral, those are very, very telling things as far as I'm concerned. So if you read, I remember reading, I had read Summer and Smoke in high school, and I really loved it. And then I stumbled across Eccentricities of a Nightingale, which is kind of Williams' riff on the same kind of characters but different. It totally blew my mind because he was able to take a similar story and plug it in a very different way, give it a lot of different context, give the vulnerability even a different twist, especially in the main female character. Um, yeah, and I thought, oh, I want to do that. I want to do that. Well, how did he do that? How did he do that? Well, he decided that it was important to investigate that particular world. And no, Williams wrote a lot of things that were really off the beaten path. His Summer and Smoke is very producible. His Streetcar Named Desire, very, very producible. Almost nobody does nine blocks on the Camino Real. His experimental play where people are running around doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Very few people do Suddenly Last Summer, or the play where the guy is holed up in a Night of the Iguana. Why? Well, they're very, very difficult plays. They're very challenging and they're very, very dark. Well, it was him looking to see, well, how far can I carry my voice? How can I explore these things that I think about, and maybe other people do. And, ultimately in your career, there's some things you do that please people and some not so much. And I think Williams understood the distinction, and he was a very, very brave playwright, I think.
How do you write vulnerability? Or can you? Or does it just happen?
It just happened just this moment. I'm acting a little bit. I think you write vulnerability by understanding what it is that the character has the greatest fears of. Um, I have a friend, and I won't name names, but I think this person right now is still writing to please other people. And I want to say to this person, I want you to take on a nom de plume. I want you to come up with a name that will make you brave and reckless and all this other stuff, because it seems to me that this person's vulnerability is, I don't want to write anything that's going to offend another person. We had a thing recently, a conversation about uh, trigger warnings. I hate trigger warnings. I hate the whole thing. If I'm going to shoot off a gun, I want the audience to know that. Okay, fine. But I don't want trigger warnings to say, well, there's a mention of, you know, uh, this, that, or the other. Like, oh, for God's sake, grow up, come to see the theater and take a chance. If you don't like it, walk out.
Isn't that what playwriting is, though?
What, triggers?
Or, yeah, I mean, facing, facing difficult
Yeah,
situations and,
yeah.
and uncomfortable,
That yeah, that's the intention. The problem is that there's too much theater that's being done, especially these days, that's careful, and that's intended not to offend anybody. And that will pass. That will go away as the generations that are doing this right now mature. Um, Somebody once said, you cannot really be an artist until you've had your heart broken. Okay, good. I ascribe to that.
Sure.
I didn't go out of my way to have it happen, but it did. So it seems to me that ultimately vulnerability is about you as a human understanding how to empathize with other people. I've met so many neurotic people in my lifetime, people who are just barely hanging on. They're just barely coping, but the way in which they're coping is absolutely gorgeous. It's astonishing because they are getting through it by one means or another. I have one friend who is, fully functional, has a job, the whole 9 yards. But once the day is over, everything is dedicated to just writing and doing nothing but writing, not watching movies, not anything else. And that is that person's safe haven, where to step out the door and go to the job is risky as hell, but they have to do it. You got to eat, you have to pay your rent, et cetera, et cetera. So, and there's an incredible, I think, beauty in vulnerable people. When we first read Oedipus, it's taught so badly because it's taught like, oh, you have to look at it like this, and it's mythology and all that. Well, look, it's a bunch of people who are screwed up. We're going to do a play here at Heller called Rocking, where the writer has taken the character of Jocasta and looking at, well, what happened to her afterwards? We don't really know. We don't follow her around. And so she's there with a couple of other kind of mythological creatures, and she's meeting a young woman who's trying to deal with fertility issues, and who's dealing with the question of whether a clearly damaged fetus should be aborted, and what the laws are saying now, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's fabulous, fabulous
Sure.
play, and your heart just goes out to that person. And you can't do anything to make it better per se, but you can be there. And I think that's the way in which if we look at our characters that way, I think it makes a huge difference.
You brought up the term earlier, and it's throughout playwriting and process. And I'm probably going to botch the pronunciation. Etude?
I say etude, yeah.
Etude?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I think that's the way it goes.
What are they?
They're basically exercises for exploration, in order to not worry about, is this working for the play? Is the play itself working? One of my great joys was in grad school, I got to work with an off campus experimental company. And we were doing a lot of work based on Viola Spolin's theater games. And so I played the character Solioni in The Three Sisters, who was a very annoying character. He's always saying irritating stuff and, just being a jerk. Well, the director had us do a game one time when I'm talking to not the woman that he's involved with, but the other guy that he's sort of a rival with that he ultimately kills. Um, and he said, let's do a contact exercise. And I said, well, how does that work? He said, well, you can't just touch them with your finger. You have to use your body, your elbow, your head, whatever you want to do. Well, I began elbowing this guy, and he really hated it. So the more I did it, the more it built up, and then I would bump it with my hip and knock him off balance. And it made me understand that Solioni is not just a character who is verbally annoying and is always getting in people's faces with his stupid jokes, but also somebody that has maybe a physical attraction to the other guy that he doesn't know how to deal with. It's not necessarily that he's gay per se, but he's just longing for any kind of contact. And that exercise taught me that. So the etudes are a way of doing those kind of explorations on one's own, and seeing how your character will behave in a given moment. Um, I met with an old girlfriend, a high school level girlfriend, she and I dated for a couple of years when I was back in Baltimore recently, and her dad was this crazy guy. I mean, in a great way. He was brilliantly crazy, funny guy. He had a whole basement full of a train setup, and you could go down there, and he had his engineer's cap, and he did the whole 9 yards. He also had a printing press, and he would print these cards that were just incredibly vile, just horrible, dirty jokes and racist jokes, that stuff. And he would hand me this thing, and I'm like, oh God, don't stop doing this. Well, that was his sense of, a place in the world for him with the trains. And then the other was, I guess, a sense of, were the cards a way of giving himself a voice? I don't really know, but it's an interesting thing. And it's a character that I've never thought of putting in a play, but I could, just to see what happens from there.
Why use etude opposed to exercise? I'm just curious.
Well, because it's broader. I was a trumpet player when I was a kid, and so you're given etudes, just to strengthen lip and tongue movement and fingering and all that. And piano players get etudes. And I thought, well, let's try to call it something other than exercise, because exercise sounds like, oh shit, I have to go to the gym. Whereas an etude, if people read my book carefully enough, they'll understand it's all about exploration. It's all about seeing how I can think through the play, but also think outside of the play and just kind of create worlds. One of the things as a director, I'm always very prone to do is, what's the moment before the curtain goes up? So character A, where are you? Oh, I'm off stage. No. Where are you in the world? Well, I'm in the bathroom. I'm washing my hands. Okay, good. What's the soap smell like? What's the towel? Is the towel crusty? Is it nice and clean? Is it made of a billion thread weave or whatever? Because I want them to bring a world in with them, and that's the idea behind the etudes. Is understand it's not just. I think exercise is oh, you do this and then you're done. I think at etude is you do it, and hopefully if you've done it with a really open mind and a really open heart, it's going to stay with you. So it's a slightly different take. Yeah.
How do you convince a playwright that that's not just work? It's like, I don't want to. That's work. It's hard enough just to write.
I'm put it out there. I'm like the guy with the fruit stand. You don't want my bananas, don't buy my bananas.
It's Yeah, and I guess I don't mean it so much in the realm of buying the book, but applying those things.
Yeah.
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 How do you encourage somebody to just like, I get it, it's work, but and I obviously these do work.
Yeah.
They're going to, but are there words of encouragement you can recommend that just like, look, I get it, but
Well, I think the starting point is how satisfied are you with your writing?
mm,
Do you feel like your writing has the depth that you're interested in conveying? If it's not, would you like to try this particular etude and see where it takes you? We're working through those right now in this group called Playwright's Lab of Tulsa. And again, what I'm seeing with not everybody, but what I'm seeing with some people is the lights are starting to go on a little bit where they're like, oh, that's right. This character has an outer life and an inner life. And I'm trying to tell the story of this little minuscule slice of their life. And it's got to be, Michael, I think it has to be informed by all the other stuff. So saying to the playwright, do you think this character could be more fully fleshed out if you did these etudes and understood a little bit more broadly who that human being is? Well, hopefully the answer is yes. I've had people say to me, and I used to use etudes in my classes, and particularly in playwriting classes at TU. Oh, I don't like this. I don't like it. Say, okay, fine. Try it, do it. Just do it for the homework, and let's see how it goes. Sometimes it would be an eye opening because I didn't think it would play very well, and now I see how it worked, and it's better. Okay, I get it now a little bit. And others people would say, no, this is not for me, and I'm like, that's fine, that's cool. Find your own journey, find your own path.
well, I think the other thing is as well, it's like I think these are phenomenal tools for playwrights who might be weak in certain areas. I mean, you've got, I think, 6 or 7 different elements that you cover with etudes, and as far as technique, character, plot, structure, collaboration, then unblocking, which I think pretty much almost everybody could benefit from. So I want to go through each of these real quick, and I'm just curious, and you may not have one, but what's your favorite technique etude that you?
I'd have to go back and look at the book. I don't remember them that well. Yeah,
that's all right. This is the moment of the episode that I do every time where I put the playwright on the spot and expect them to know things from their own work especially that might be years and years ago. So
let me go through here. This is the technique that I think probably the key etude. Oh, for heaven's sake, don't bother me. The key etude for them, it seems like to me, it's always the Kickstarter, and this one is called. Oops, sorry, I hit the wrong button. This one is called Stage Directions Only. And it's an etude that invites the writer to forego dialogue and just look at behavior, and it can be really, really simple stuff. It doesn't have to be too complicated. For example, you have a character who is extremely meticulous when he or she comes home. So they have a bowl, and into that bowl goes their keys, their wallet. The next thing they do is they go plug in their phone. All right. So what do you learn from that person? And then what about the person who comes home and just throws everything everywhere and doesn't really think about it? Well, I worked with some actors who were so anal about how they did the performance that when they had an accident on stage and couldn't hold on to their anal pre-decision process, everything actually became much more natural and much more real. The whole idea of any kind of etude like Stage Directions Only is to say, okay, well, how can we get rid of a character, and especially, my God, this drives me crazy, characters narrating themselves. They don't really say dialogue so much as they kind of tell you who. David Mamet has this great example. Hello, because I just got back from Vietnam. I think that's absolutely a genius example. We don't provide all kinds of exposition. I'm doing it here because you're asking me questions about my work, but I don't do it when I'm having a regular conversation, for sure. So that's the key etude to technique, and some of the other ones touch on. Let me see. Um, let's see. Doing adaptation, doing a prose treatment of your script, because again, people get lost because they are trying to often they're trying to force a play to behave, force it to do what they had in mind. And one of the things that I preach over and over to people is, look, everything as writers, everything is adaptation. You have an idea, you have a spark, but then you got to try to get that spark down on the page, and you can't write the whole play in 10 seconds. So as you're doing the writing, let's say it's over a month or 6 months or whatever, you're evolving as a person. You're changing. You're learning new things. You're having new experiences. You're having setbacks, all that stuff. It's about understanding that that's what your characters go through as well. So if you're just dealing with, like I have another one that's the etude is called radio play. I've written for radio, and it's not easy because you have to create a sonic landscape as well as a landscape that has really engaging dialogue, because people can just tune to the next station if they're not involved.
Right.
So yeah. So that's technique.
Do you recommend that people go back and listen to those, or would you recommend them listening to them or reading them?
Everything that I do in terms of workshops, we meet together and people bring in their work, and they have somebody else read their work to them, to the workshop.
Sure. But
So
I'm sorry, I did not.
no,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
I was more going back to the actual radio play.
Oh,
If
that.
people were using that as a tool, as a research tool, would you recommend them listening to radio plays, the old ones, or
Well,
reading them?
not the old ones. If somebody wants, I think I may have included some references in the most recent draft of the or edition of the book. But there are programs that the National Theater, uh, National Radio Theater, I think is what it's called, is a great source for that kind of stuff. A lot of modern radio is very different from the Shadow Knows and all that kind of stuff,
Sure.
because it's a different world, it's a different audience, it's a different, people have a different way of listening than they did 40, 50, 60 years ago. I recommend that if they can find radio plays, that they read them. Yeah, if you want to read the old ones, but don't just stick to the known ones. Like there's a book that I stumbled across, and it's a series of short comedies for radio called Vic and Sadie. And Vic is always getting into some kind of mischief with his son. There's one where he notices that the wife notices that the washer in the basement is giving her a shock. So he and the son go down and try to get bigger shocks out of it rather than fixing it.
I think they call that Rick and Morty now.
Well, whatever it is, it is a particular style of radio, because you're using that bzzzt sound
Sure.
from the washer. Yeah.
So I interrupted you when you were going through this. You were recommending that you hand it to somebody else.
Oh yeah, I mean, certainly with theater, it has to be read aloud, or what's the point? I mean, you've got to hear whether it's flowing. I just had some neck surgery. You'll have to forgive me. I'm always massaging my neck these days. You've got to be able to hear, first of all, what it sounds like to you, that as you heard it in your head, as opposed to how you're hearing it from actors, but also when it's read aloud and then you have a talk back. It encourages people to say, if you're open to it, well, this line doesn't quite land, or this whatever, and talkbacks are tricky, but so I encourage people I always end, when we've had a reading, I always start it with, okay, to the writer, what do you want to hear? If there's anything in particular that you're interested in having us address, like you want to talk about your plot today or whatever, you can say that, or I'm open to anything. And then the group is directed not to rewrite, but to ask questions and to make statements about stuff where they were either confused or where they fell in love or whatever it may be, so that the playwright, David Cranes, who created the original Sundance Lab, had this great line about, after a talkback, the playwright should feel so encouraged that they would run up the mountain to start rewriting it. And that's a beautiful image, somebody just pell-mell going up to hit hit that laptop. So yeah.
No, it's lovely. I mean, I can't tell you how many times in writers groups that we're, I'll be working on something and the feedback, next thing you know, is like, I put it away. And I've gotten to the point now where I will finish a draft before I go for feedback on like the 10 pages that I'm working on, or the 15 pages that I'm working on, because then I'm just going to go back and rework those first 15 pages rather than move forward. And it just holds me back in that regard.
Yeah. And I think that's a very personal decision. It's a personal artistic decision.
Sure. And again, I'll put you on the spot. And if you don't have favorite ones, or if this is too on the spot, I would like to go through each one. Like character etude, is there one that you really like? And you don't have to go through all of them. Just if there's one that you go to, like when you first do your workshops, this is the one these are your go-to etudes for each one of these elements.
Right. Well, the age exploration, I think, is really fascinating. It's the one that, again, it allows people to think of the lifespan of a character. So if you're playing Willie Loman, or you're writing Willie Loman rather, what was Willie Loman like at 5 years old? Was he the kid that never got chosen on the playground? Maybe, that line that the neighbor has. Well, he's liked, but he's not, or maybe it's Willie's line. He's liked, but he's not well liked. Mm-hmm. Oh man, what, oh my Lord, I think the reality of exploring a character is understanding that. And I had an exercise. It might have come from Gary. It might have been my embellishing, and I can't really remember. But the idea of the exercise is called the fives, or it could be called the 20s. It doesn't matter. The numbers are relevant. But what happened 5 seconds before this scene? What happened 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 years, 5 decades? Okay. So that you're tracking back and trying to understand what is the arc of this person's life that's having them make these decisions right now. Why do they make the decisions that they do? If we could conjure in our minds why in Angels in America, why Harper marries Joe. Why? Because he's clearly not quite right to her. She understands that there's something, but she doesn't know what it is. And then as the marriage goes on and he's not affectionate with her, and they're not having they're not having intercourse, why does she stay, et cetera, et cetera? All those things, all the factors that go into the personality of a given character, those are explorations.
And what about a plot etude?
All right, plot etude. Probably for that one, the one that's been the most effective for my students. Well, the photo, we just did that one where you go through a photography book, or even I did this when I was in a conference in Poland, and I didn't have any books with me, and there was no library close by. So I found some magazines in the lobby and brought those to the workshop. And there was a photo of a horse statue. And then there was a photo of, I think, a marketplace someplace with lots of vegetables and stuff. And I said, okay, put the horse in a scene at the market. Make it a person who is a horse, or who's like a horse, or make it a horse. I don't care. It doesn't matter. But how would they interact in that world, because they're there unexpectedly? This is not natural for this horse to be there. Or if it's just a guy, their images, I use a lot of images from people like Diane Arbus, and there's a guy named Ralph Meatyard who did a lot of very crazy Southern Gothic kind of scary photos in abandoned houses, and et cetera. I mean, there's tons and tons of great photographers out there, and saying, okay, well, what if I take this person and get a sense of who they might be, and then plunk them in to an entirely different world? How do they react in that world? How do they, what are their coping mechanisms for being in the world? So, yeah.
All right. And what about structure?
Structure is the one that came last, except for the unblocking. And structure actually came from, I had given the manuscript of this book to Applause Theater Books in New York, hoping that Glenn would published the book, and they kept it for a long time, 6 months before
Mm.
finally turning it down. And then they eventually they published their own book written by a famous playwright with full of exercises, which my sorry,
No, you're good.
stop.
Oh, there, well, I couldn't hear it at first. Now I'm
Yeah,
picking it up a little bit, but you're good.
I didn't know how to turn that off, and I forgot that it was going to come on.
You're
Anyway,
fine.
ultimately, they published a book by a famous playwright, and I don't think his exercises are nearly as good as mine. But in the process, the guy, I don't remember who it was. There was a guy who was a theater guy at Columbia whose comments back to the book were really, really good. They were very helpful. And one of the things he said was, I don't understand why there's nothing about structure.
Mm.
And I thought, well, that's really cool. So the restructuring exercise is one that I do often with groups, which is to say, write something in 10 simple points. He wakes up, he brushes his teeth and goes to 3, he goes to work. 4, he gets fired. 5, he comes back and sets his apartment on fire, whatever it may be. Now, you got those 10 points, scramble them just for the hell of it. Put point 9 first, just to see what does that do by moving it around. Because again, we are trained like monkeys to be very, very linear. And I'm always trying to liberate playwrights and screenwriters from thinking in those terms. You have to a certain extent, think linearly for commercial work. But a lot of times, the work that people are, the kind of work people are doing, really comes down to, are you really able to capture the world as you see it, the characters as you see them? Are you really able to let loose of old style rounded circular kind of a beginning, middle, and end storytelling? What if you started with the end? Betrayal is the best example of that.
Sure.
So the idea with the restructuring is to say, well, what would happen if you took that apart in a different way? Now, there's an exercise at some other point in the book, I don't remember what it is, based on writing plot points down on note cards. Do that, write 10, 20, whatever, and then shuffle them. Just play with them and see what happens when number 12 turns up on top. What do you do from there? Because again, the whole point of any of this stuff is to open people's minds to the possible rather than the likely. Because to me, that's what's wrong with American playwriting in general. And I'm not knocking contemporary playwrights. There's a lot of really genius people out there doing incredible work. So I'm not putting that down at all. I'm just saying, for the journey person playwright, for the novice playwright, for even the person who's got a little bit of a career going, how do you break free of the things that inhibit you? And again, these etudes can do that for you.
And again, I think, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, the structure etude isn't, in rearranging it, isn't to say that your play cannot be linear. It's just to see if you discover something else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like driving a different route to get to the same place.
Sure.
Maybe every day you go on the interstate, and then one day you think, well, how would I get there if I just went on the back roads? I had that experience in Baltimore. Siri was taking me all over the place, and I had no idea where I was going because I don't know that part of the city of Baltimore. I grew up in a suburb, and I spent time in Baltimore City, but not in some of the sections that this took me through. I loved it. I loved it because it was like a big surprise party on wheels, So
Sure. Collaboration?
Yeah. I've done a little bit of it. My most successful collaboration was with my friend John Nassavera, and we decided I'd read the play. I've got the sequence probably upside down here. I had seen Sweeney Todd, and then I read the play that was written, the modern play that was written, where it's all psychological reasons why Sweeney acts as he does.
Mm-hmm.
And I was talking to John, who at that time was the literary manager at New Dramatists. And he said, well, there are original versions of this. I said, really? He said, yeah, they go back to the 18th century. No kidding. And he said, oh, yeah, it's a classic melodrama. No kidding. So John was a research maven. And he went to the New York Public Library, and sure enough, he found a couple of editions way back of original stories of Sweeney Todd, where it's not psychological at all. He just likes killing people and taking their money. And Mrs. Lovett's the same way. She likes killing people and taking money. Um, so we created a different, more truly melodramatic version of it. And by that, I mean it's not a hiss the village, throw peanuts kind of melodrama. It's a real legitimate melodrama based on a lot of research that both he and I did about performance styles of the era and all the other stuff that went along with it. That was great. I loved that collaboration because he would come in with an idea and say, "Well, I'm going to try this," and I'd say, "Perfect, I love it. Go ahead and write it." And then I had a different idea, and and we started putting it all together. It was also adaptation, so it was a little easier. Then I worked with a very dear friend of mine who was a manic outliner,
Mm.
and by the time we got to it was a film. It was a film about a company who's filming a werewolf story in like Bavaria or someplace, and actual werewolves show up.
Mm.
And it was a great idea, but by the time we were done outlining the thing, I said, "I'm Bruce. I can't go on. We have the story, and I don't really care anymore. There's nothing for to explore or to be surprised by. And he understood. It was okay. So
So what's an etude that you would do for collaboration?
well, that's a great question. I think probably agreeing that there's a story that wants telling, but needs telling from some different points of view.
Oh.
And certainly, the Moises Kaufman thing, the Laramie Project, is certainly an
Oh,
example of that. It's collaborating with real people in that
right.
instance. So, I
Okay.
think I think the etudes would include things like character exploration. I think they would have to include things like plot and structure exploration. Um, yeah, I think the idea of collaborating with someone on a single piece comes down to a willingness to not compromise until compromise is going to be creative,
Mm.
you know, and just seeing where it takes you from there. So.
And the final one is unblocking etude.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I had this was my unblocking story. It might be in the book. I don't remember. Um, the I was going to have breakfast actually with Bruce. He and I met every Saturday for breakfast, and a lot of times we would just talk, and then other times I would just kind of bitch and moan about, I'm not getting anywhere. I don't know what this play's about. So I was on my way to meet him, and I was in a state, and I'm just going to Bruce will be pouring all this vitriol into his ear. But I stopped to check the mail. And in the mail was a letter with a letterhead from the National Endowment for the Arts. And I thought, oh, great, perfect. I can start my day with rejection. That's even better. And I opened it up and it said, congratulations, you've been awarded. Well, I took wings. I floated down the sidewalk, and yeah, and then I said to Bruce, "I'm not going to complain this week. Look, 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 look." So, um, that made me realize that I had let being blocked on the particular play of the moment become the important thing rather than finding creative ways to move through the block. So the reality of it became, what can we do? How can we liberate ourselves from talking ourselves out of making our work move, not making, letting our work move forward. So the first one that I came up with was having the character, or making the block itself into a character, and
Mm.
writing a dialogue between yourself and the character. Okay, hi, you're blocked. What's going on? Well, I don't really like this play. Oh, you don't? Why don't you like the play? Well, I don't think it's very good. Well, why not? And just playing, having somebody that your block be a lawyer, being a devil's advocate, being a loving uncle who can see your flaws, and is not your parent, and so you're more willing to listen to that person, or whatever it may be. So that was the idea, and then the other ones kind of came along on their own bit by bit. I would say, going back to the collaboration, the character collaboration, I think is the key at it, etude. And again, it comes down to having a lot of conversations about personalities. So you've got a given character, and using maybe kind of a verbal technique of exploring with your partner. What are the things about the character that you need to know, even if they're like, this is like free writing in a way. What are, if they're even completely irrelevant? Does he or she tie their shoes by lacing up one lace all the way up the shoe and then filling in the other lace so that you've got the cross lacing, but rather than stopping and putting each lace in
Mm.
one at a time? What does that tell you about the character? I was reading something somewhere, speaking of, where on All in the Family, there's a beat that they get into an argument, Archie and Mike, about whether you put on both socks first, then your shoes, or one sock, one shoe
Mm.
at a time, et cetera, et cetera. And they worked that out as an improv before actually putting it into the show. And I thought, see, that's genius. That's really something. Arguments over stupid things like, does the toilet paper go under or over? Oh my God. But you learn so much from those conversations. And then, of course, that leads you to say, oh, my uncle, oh my God, my uncle, this is what he would do. And my aunt, oh, no, so you start drawing on observable histories that, again, you can start kind of plugging in that kind of character motivation and texture and desire and vulnerability and resistance and all the things that go into that.
What can we talk about the process of the National Endowment for the Arts and how that transpired?
Yeah,
Or have
yeah.
things changed since that time?
Probably this is a long time back. This is back in the 70s, or late 70s, early 80s. In those days, you submitted your play in 10 copies, and I was actually getting annoyed. I was in the cafeteria of St. Francis College in Brooklyn, where I was teaching. I was getting really frustrated because I couldn't get the damn things through the holes in the, And one of my students came by and he said, "What's the matter? What's going on with you?" I said, "I can't." He said, "Well, let me help you." Because I was ready to just throw in the towel and say, "Screw it. I'm not going to bother mailing this stuff out." So he helped me and I mailed them out and it came back. Once you were awarded the grant, that was pretty much it. You could do whatever you wanted. I used it to buy my first computer, which is a brand that very few people would even remember these days. It's called a Morrow, Morrow.
Wow.
It used two discs. One was your software program disk, and the other was the disk that you wrote on. And I used that for a long time until finally I discovered my first Apple and then went on from there. Well, I also used that for a bit of paying for making script copies, paying for mailing and stuff like that. In the ensuing year, it also put me in a situation where, I mean, mailing costs in those days were not like they are now, but still, it was expensive. So I thought, well, this place is valid. It's got a validation from the a portion of the government or whatever the endowment is. And that's your imprimatur. So I started mailing scripts off on a much more regular basis. I had the money for it, and I also had the impetus, and that ended up with actors Playwrights Theater of Washington accepting the play and producing it. So it was it was just one of those brilliant, building a beautiful bridge. Yeah.
Wonderful. Earlier, you mentioned a pet peeve, which was having your characters narrate.
Yeah.
What's another one that you find that happens frequently with your students that you find that you have to break them of?
Having the characters sort of explain why they're like they are psychologically. That's the biggest one. The self narration is kind of it's exposition about why they're there in that particular moment, and then the psychological exposition is why they're like they are.
Do you think that's necessary at all? Does it matter why they're like that?
Why the characters like
within the
that, or why
play?
they're, sorry, we're talking over each other. Say again.
Within the play, do you think it's necessary within the play for them to come out and this is why I behave this way?
No,
You,
no, 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 no. I think the character needs to behave as they have to in order to try to get the thing that they're pursuing. One of my favorite etudes, by the way, is a fantasy outcome. A character will pursue what they hope will happen with all their might until finally something says, well, you can't have it. Hamlet, he wants his mom to not be married to the guy. He doesn't really want to marry Ophelia, but he'll put up with it if that's the necessary circumstance. But basically, he wants to be the true king and rule the country as best as he can, et cetera, et cetera. His original thing is he really just wants to go back to Germany and be a student and party. And every time one of those gets thwarted, he's like, okay, shit, and then he tries something else. Ultimately, he can't predict what's going to happen to him because he's caught up in this fantasy of what he's after. And we're talking about a playwright who used soliloquies and stuff to explain internal processes. Right. But even there, Shakespeare's brilliance is that we don't really have any real background on why Hamlet is so tormented about having dreams. We just know that he's afraid of his dreams because he thinks if being dead is like having the kind of dreams he has all the time, he can't cope. Yeah.
So it's not that, I mean, it's fine. Like the playwright should know why, but he doesn't have to be on the page.
I think it shouldn't. I mean, you can, we're going to do this play, Rocking in Development. And I think that it's perfectly fair game for the actors to ask all the questions that they have about why this and why that about the character. But I also think I think two things. I think one is fair game for the playwright to say, well, not going to tell you. I want you to explore, and then we'll talk about it in another week of rehearsals and see if you're getting a better sense of it. And then if not, then I'll try to be a little bit more helpful. And then the other side of it is, well, they do this because, and that's sometimes it's more for self-discovery on the part of the playwright, because they don't necessarily have a full awareness every moment of every play of what it is that they've written and what's influencing them when they write it. Again, this goes back to not having people try to base their plays on having read Tennessee Williams. It's okay to read Williams, but leave him at home.
Right.
Yeah.
What is there an element that you find that students struggle the most with?
Trusting that they have original stories. Especially in screenwriting classes, I will always say to them, okay, no sci-fi Star Wars stuff, no mafia stuff, unless have you been in the mafia? Oh, you haven't? Is your dad in the mafia? No. Okay, well then no. You don't know anything about it. If you watch a Scorsese film, he's directing stories that he knows about directly. He knows, if you read like Mean Streets, if you watch Mean Streets, he understands exactly what that world is about, and he can tell it truthfully. I think a lot of young writers feel they don't have enough experience to draw from, but that's not the point. The point is what stories that you've experienced through other people interest you. I started to write a play, and I'll come back to this one of these days, but it's basically a play where one character encourages another to do something that they both know is dangerous, but the second character is willing to do it because he so desperately wants the first character's approval. And it results in an injury that haunts the guy through the rest of his life. And why do they come together? When did they come together? Why did he do this in the first place? What was so important that he would risk his health on doing this crazy thing, et cetera, et cetera? Where is he now? Years later, decades later, is he bitter about it, or is he accepting of it? Did he say, okay, well, this messed up my shoulder permanently, but that gave me the opportunity to learn how to do this, and so I might never have done it, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Where can people find your work, Michael?
Which work is that? My books?
Sure, your books and your plays.
Well, my plays aren't published, and this has been a real problem that I've finally kind of given up on. It's not worth the hassle. It's very difficult to get your plays published these days. I could go. There's a uh, there's a publishing house. Friend of mine has gotten a couple of her plays published, Megan Gogarty, and I can't remember the name of it. I'm going to get up for a second and look on my bookshelf. Okay.
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, because it might not be something people are aware of. It's called Original Works,
Okay.
and they publish plays. Um, I have what am I doing? I have purchased a few from them because again, they're written by friends of mine, and I want to read their work, and I won't be able to see their work because we don't live in proximity. Um, as it happens, the one that I grabbed was by a guy named Ernie Joslowitz, who was one of the literary managers at Playwrights Theater of Washington. And I didn't even know he wrote plays, so I came across this. So yeah, I probably should. I had well, you asked me about rejections. A friend, a person I thought was a friend, had a play publishing company with his wife, and he said, I'd love to see some of your work, see if we could publish your work. I said, great. So I sent him, like, I don't know, 5 plays. And we had a conversation one night on the phone where he basically told me why each play wasn't good enough. And I'm so depressed. Oh my God. Getting published is very, very difficult unless you've had a regional or a Broadway production. Sam French doesn't care about you. Small presses don't really publish theater very much. It's a tricky market. So, this place, Original Works, is great. They're online. People can go and find their offerings and maybe submit their work. And I probably should. I've been caught up in writing novels for the
Fair
last
enough.
4 years.
Have you considered New Play Exchange, the online?
Yes and no. Again, I'm much more invested in not only novel writing but in teaching than in promoting my work at this
Fair
point.
enough. All right. Well, speaking of promoting your work, then where can people find your other books as far as about playwriting?
Right. Well, those are all published by Hackett Publishers in Boston, and they're available on Amazon. There's one that I did a first edition of it, and then I couldn't quite figure out how to do a second edition. Not that I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure out how to do it in the way that I really wanted to.
Right.
But it's out there in used copies, and people might enjoy it. It's called Playwriting at Work and Play. And basically, I went to as many new play development programs that I could: Shenandoah, New Dramatists, the O'Neill, 2 iterations of Sundance, and interviewed people there about their process and how they work. Like Sundance, for example, under David Crane's, the original one, always had creative artists on campus so that you could work with them, and they weren't theater people. There was a painter, there was a guy, Kenny Raskin, who was an acrobat and clown that had been in the Broadway production of Beauty and the Beast as like the guy who accompanies the hero. There was a guy, brilliant guy, who specialized in ritual studies, and so he would go from rehearsal to rehearsal and say, well, I read your play, and here's where I see some ritual elements that maybe you're not as aware of as you might like to be, and et cetera. Just great. They call them resource artists. Just great people to talk to. So when I was running Women Works, which is a defunct program, but when I was at TU, I was running it for graduate female playwrights. Submit your work. If we choose you, we bring you to campus for a week. We workshop your play. We do 2 readings and with talkbacks and all that. One of the people that I brought in was a painter friend of mine who would read the play and then bring in books of paintings by other people that somehow the play suggested to him, so that there would be some images for the playwright that might not be directly about the play, but would create kind of ancillary ways of looking at how the play resonates in other contexts simply besides theater. Um, I also brought in occasionally I would bring in somebody from the psychology department just to talk about things like, family place. What's the difference between the world of the firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn? How the middle child? Oh my God, all this stuff that goes along with that. So yeah, resource artists and all that. So playwriting at Work and Play focuses on that. And again, it's still out there if anybody wants to look for it on eBay or Powell's used books or that kind of stuff. You can find it. I think it's a great resource. If anybody wants to contact me, if you want to give them my email address, I'll just send them a copy of the manuscript because it's basically a dead duck, So.
Well, on that note, that's my next question to you is, how can people reach you? Are you on the socials or?
I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram and in both cases I'm on there as Michael Play, 3 different words, Michael Playwright. Because there's a lot of people named Michael Wright in this world, believe it or not. It's almost like John Smith. And my email is the letter M and then my full name. So M Michael Wright, and Michael is spelled AEL, mmichaelwright@gmail.com.
Wonderful.
And I'm totally welcome for people to reach out to me. Some of the books that I've done over the years and some of the experiences I had, you were asking earlier about my bio line about World Interplay, which was a program in Australia that I went to 3 times or 3, I think, that brought together playwrights of between the ages of 18 and 25 from around the world. And I got to be there because a guy found one of my books and had my contact info in there, and he could reach me, and et cetera. So I love when that kind of stuff happens. Yeah.
Absolutely, Michael. This was fascinating to me and so insightful and so educational. I could probably talk to you for another hour and a half, but and since you had an extra, I will stop talking your ear off. But I really appreciate
you asked great questions. Let's make sure that it's clear that it takes a really good interviewer to encourage somebody to really open up and say all the stuff that they want to say. This is not necessarily my natural vibe. Okay. So
no, I appreciate it. It's, again, like you've given so much information that I really, I think that people will really enjoy this episode. So thank you for coming on to the Playwright Spotlight.
Yep. You're welcome. You're absolutely welcome. So, all right.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Playwright Spotlight. Again, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below. Tell us your favorite part of this episode, and be sure to share this video with a friend that you might think could benefit from this episode. If you're listening to us on your favorite podcast platform, be sure to leave a 5-star review and subscribe to the channel. And in the meantime, and until we see each other again, keep writing.